Well, good evening, folks at home. We'll be starting in about a minute. We good? Now, there's no little picture in the thing. That's okay, right?
That is totally fine. And I will.
Yeah. Oh, you check to make sure it's
I'll get on Facebook.
Yeah.
Here, go ahead and talk.
Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3.
Oh. It's going to start picking up the...
Yeah. You want to go check it out there?
Yeah, you're good.
Test 1 2 3. We're good. Good.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Technology, I love so much. Okay, well, good evening to folks here in our classroom, and good evening to folks on Facebook and watching either live or later on. This is the last session for this semester of what I've been calling Acts and Beyond. We spent most of our time on going through the whole book of Acts, and when we finished the book of Acts, I've spent the last 2 or 3 weeks the beyond part, which is the history of the church condensed down to jumping, over 100 years in 5 seconds, or, very, very quick run through the history of the church. And tonight, I want to end by talking about Methodism. How do we get to where we are today? So that's our topic for the evening. And just to remind us of how we almost got to Methodism, we get to Methodism by way of the Church of England. The Anglican Church is the branch that Methodist springs from. And I think last week we talked a little bit about the birth of the Church of England. How Henry VIII in the 16th century, because he wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope would not grant the divorce, or really the annulment, so that he could marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Henry made the rather momentous decision to break from the Roman Catholic Church and declare himself the head of the Church of England. And thus was born the Church of England, aka the Anglican Church, aka the Episcopal Church here in the U.S. And that is the church that John Wesley comes out of, the Church of England. And so if you're drawing a tree, as I kind of talk about when we talk about denominations and we talk about church history, often you think about it as a tree. And for the first 1,000 years, from the book of Acts up until about 1,000 years, there are denominations. There are just churches. There is the rise of leaders and bishops, but there is no splits until the first 1,000 years, around the year 1000 AD, there's the split between West and East, Roman Catholic and Orthodox. Orthodox in the East, headquartered in Constantinople. The West, headquartered in Rome. That's the first split. Then the split we talked about in the last couple of weeks is on the Western side, the Protestant Reformation, where through Martin Luther, John Calvin, others, the Protestants and the Catholics split in Europe. And that all happens preceding up to Henry VIII and his decision to break from the Catholic Church and declare himself the head of the Church of England. So that happens in the middle of the 1600s, in the middle of the 16th century, in the middle of the 1500s. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit now to Methodism. And of course, I'm going to spend the big first chunk of the time talking about the founder of Methodism, the person responsible for the Methodist movement, John Wesley. Because we, in the Methodist Church, we define ourselves as Wesleyan. So John Wesley was born in 1703, on actually June 28th of 1703, in a town called Epworth, England. Some of you know I was fortunate enough, and it's been, 6 years ago, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. I, along with 3 other Methodist pastors, 4 of us traveled to England specifically to spend 2 weeks tracing the life of John Wesley. And so what we did was, it was myself, Ray Crawford, who's the pastor at First Methodist Claremore, Bob Feist, who's the pastor at Christ Methodist here in Tulsa, and Leslie Broadbent, who used to be at First Methodist Oklahoma City. He's now in Texas. The 4 of us traveled to England and followed the life of John Wesley. So as soon as we landed in London, we got in some cars and drove to Epworth, England, so we could start at his birthplace. And we traced Wesley's life, starting there. So Epworth, England is where John Wesley was born in 1703. His parents were Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel and Susanna Wesley gave birth to 19 children. 19 children, of which 9 survived infancy. So, of the 19 children she bore, 9 survived infancy. John was number 15 out of the 19. And, that was not all that uncommon in the early 1700s to have that many children and to have many of them not survive. And of course, in many cases, the mother didn't survive some of those childbirths either. But John Wesley was born as the number 15 out of 19 children born to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel Wesley was the rector, we would just say the pastor. Samuel Wesley was the pastor of the Church of England church in Epworth, England. He was the parish priest. And so they lived in a parsonage, or they would call it a rectory. We would call it a parsonage. And one of the things that in studying Methodist history and specifically studying the life of John Wesley, Samuel Wesley, his father, was not a particularly great pastor. He was more interested in writing poetry and in writing commentaries as opposed to actually pastoring the church. So he was not a particularly effective pastor, and he was an even worse manager of finances. He went to debtor's prison more than once, which was something that happened in England in those days. And he would go to London to spend months working on his book, his commentary that, of course, eventually. But he would go to London for months at a time. And one of the times when Samuel Wesley was in London working on his book, his commentary, he left his wife and all those children, and he left the church at Epworth in charge of an associate pastor, an assistant pastor, who was not very good, especially was not a good preacher, was a poor preacher, and all of his sermons seemed to be about staying out of debtor's prison. And the attendance at the church diminished down to a handful of people. Susanna Wesley, on the other hand, she in those days taught the children, all of her children were homeschooled, and didn't just teach them what we think of as the normal things you would teach children. She taught them Latin, she taught them Greek, she taught them the classics of literature, all kinds of things as they were children. Even with all those children, she had every week one-on-one time with each child at some point during the week, and was a really model of an amazing mother and woman. Well, she knew that this assistant pastor was not a good leader and not a good preacher. And she wanted her children to know the Bible, because that was part of their education, of course, was the Bible. So once a week, Susanna Wesley gathered her children around the kitchen table and taught them Bible lessons, taught them lessons from the Bible. Well, some neighbors knew about that and asked if they could listen, because Susanna was an excellent teacher. So they started coming to listen to her teach her children the Bible lessons. Well, then more people came, and then more people came. And then there were people standing outside the windows. And before you know it, there were a couple of 100 people showing up every week to listen to Susanna Wesley teach the Bible to her children. Many, many more people than were coming to the church, where the associate pastor was preaching to a primarily empty room. Well, the associate pastor, of course, got a bit out of shape about this. And he wrote to Samuel Wesley in London and said, please order your wife to stop doing this. Please order your wife to stop, doing this. It's embarrassing, it's insulting that all these people are listening to her and no one's coming to listen to me. So he wrote to Samuel Wesley. And so Wesley wrote and told Susanna she needed to stop. And Susanna wrote back to Samuel, and I can't quote it exactly, but the letter was something along the lines of, my dear, if you order me to stop, I will stop. But if you do, the people's souls and salvation will be on your head. And he never ordered her to stop. So Susanna Wesley goes down as really a very significant woman and the primary, perhaps, teacher of John Wesley as a child. Samuel Wesley does not fare as well in history as his wife. So John Wesley grows up in this household. Like many children, at the age of 11, he's sent off to a boarding school, which was very harsh and very rigorous. But before that happened, one of the other key moments in John Wesley's young life was when he was 5 years old. When he was 5 years old, the parsonage, or as they say, the rectory, the parsonage was caught on fire. Many believe it was set on fire by unhappy parishioners. But the parsonage was burning. And the parents were getting everybody out of the house as it was burning. And the only one left on the second story of the parsonage was little 5-year-old John Wesley. And, they needed to get him out before he perished. And two men, one stood on the shoulders of the other man, and they were able to reach up and get little 5-year-old John Wesley out of the window on the second story before he perished in the fire. And after that, Susanna thought, God has a plan for him. God has rescued him for a reason. There's a reason that little John has been rescued from the fire. God has something special in mind for him. So Wesley himself looked back on that incident and saw God's hand in that. So Wesley, as the son of a preacher, thought, of course, the natural thing for him to do would be to pursue priesthood in the Church of England as well. He went to Oxford. When the four of us traveled to England, we went from Epworth to Oxford. So Wesley went to Oxford, where he studied theology, where he was ordained first as a deacon and then as a priest in the Church of England. He also, being ordained there as a priest in the Church of England, he went ahead and got a master's degree at Oxford and started teaching at Oxford, teaching philosophy and Greek. And he did that for a couple of years there at Oxford. Then his father wanted him to come back to Epworth and help him with the church. And John Wesley did that for a couple of years. Then he went back to Oxford to continue teaching. And when he went back to Oxford to continue teaching, he found that his younger brother, Charles Wesley, and a few other Oxford undergrads had formed a Bible study group. A handful of them were meeting weekly in a Bible study group. And when John came back to teach at Oxford, he sort of took control of the group and became the leader of the group that his brother had started. And this group of college students at Oxford were very serious about their faith. They got up and prayed from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. every day. So they would get up and prayed for 3 hours every morning from 6 to 9. Studied the Bible every day. They visited the prisons and visited the prisoners. They were hardcore in their desire to be very, very, very devoted disciples of Christ. But even though it was the 1700s, this was not normal for college students. It was not normal for college students to live like that. So the other college students at Oxford ridiculed them, made fun of them, and they called them the devastating, derogatory term, they called them enthusiasts. Enthusiasts. Which in the 1700s, to be called an enthusiast would probably be likely to us calling somebody a fanatic. You know, somebody who is way, way overboard. So they called them enthusiasts. They called them the Bible moths. They called them the Holy Club. They called them the Methodists. The Methodists. Because they were so methodical. Because they were so regimented in the way they lived their lives. Especially John Wesley himself. John Wesley had a journal. A daily, we would call it a planner, I guess, that he had in his daily planner what he was to do every 15 minutes of the day. 9 o'clock, 9:15, 9:30, 9:45, 10 o'clock, 10:50. Every 15 minutes of the day marked out as to what he was to be doing for those 15 minutes. And he had a notation next to every 15 minutes of the day, judging himself on his level of devotion for that 15 minutes, where he would rank himself on a scale of 1 to 9. Every 15 minutes. That is how regimented, and that's one reason why they called this group the Methodists. And it was meant as a joke. It was meant as a an insult. It was meant as a derogatory term to ridicule them for their spending 3 hours every morning in prayer, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's where the name Methodist came from, was from this Bible study at Oxford. So, after a while, Wesley, signed on to a group of settlers who were coming to America, specifically to Savannah, Georgia. There was a group of British settlers who had decided to become part of a new settlement in Savannah, Georgia, and the settlement needed a priest. And so John signed on to go with this group and live in Savannah and be the priest for this settlement in Savannah, Georgia. So he's on the ship going over from England to the American colonies. Remember, we're talking about, this happened in 1735. So America is still a British colony at this time. So he sails to Georgia. And on the way to Georgia, the ship gets in the middle of a terrible storm. The frontispiece of the ship breaks off. There's damage to the ship. There's fear that they were going to all die. And that they're in a terrible storm. And all the Brits on board are panicked and terrified. But also on board the ship is a group of Moravian Christians. Now, Moravian Christians, that's as in Bohemia, as in what today we would call Czechoslovakia. Okay, there were a group of Moravian Christians, and these, in the middle of the storm, as all the Brits are panicking and screaming and saying we're all going to die, the Moravian Christians were quietly singing and praying, calm as cucumbers. They were singing and praying on the ship while everybody else was panicking. And Wesley saw this. He saw this group of Moravian Christians and how calm they were, that they were, in the middle of the storm, they were singing and praying. And he started to have this idea of, they've got something that I don't have. That they have something that I'm missing. And that made an impression on him, these Moravian Christians. So, gets to Georgia. And in Wesley's mind, he's going to be the priest for this settlement, but in Wesley's mind, the thing he really wants to do is to convert the American Indian, the Native Americans. He wants to bring the gospel to the Native American people. But he's busy with being the pastor of this settlement community. And his time there is less than successful. For one, he wanted everybody to get up at 6 o'clock and pray for several hours. And that did not go over very well. He wanted he wanted a very, very deeply, heavily committed form of faith to be enforced in this community. And most of the people were not willing to go as hardcore as he was. That wasn't, and he didn't convert a single Native American also. He didn't have any luck with that. But the most troubling thing about what happened with Wesley's time in Georgia is he fell in love with Sophie. The woman named Sophia. He fell in love with Sophie Hopke, one of the young women settlers. And they started to court, as it would be in those times. But he was torn, between the idea of his job, his ministry, and he was, she thought, okay, he's going to propose, he wants to marry me, we're going to be married. But Wesley just kept waffling, and he was kind of keeping his distance, and every time she thought he was going to get more serious and propose, he didn't. And she felt like he was stringing her along. So she finally broke off with John Wesley and married another man. Well, Wesley, and how the story is told probably varies from who's telling it, but he felt that this new couple, his former girlfriend and her new fiancé, were not sufficiently pious to receive communion. So he refused to serve them communion. The new fiancé / husband decided to take him to court, to take Wesley to court for this. And Wesley, seeing the handwriting on the wall, ran back to England. Well, sailed back to England. Left. And he sailed back to England as a failure, depressed, defeated, feeling like, his whole time there had been a big flop. So Wesley goes back to England, basically with his tail between his legs, because of this lawsuit that was going to be filed against him and of course many would say, well, he's just out of spite, he wouldn't serve him communion, it was just out of, whatever. But he was a failure. He gets back to England, he gets back to London, and he is in depression. He writes in his journal something like, I'm not even sure I'm a Christian. I mean, he's very down. But some of his friends, to encourage him, they want him to come to a Bible study. They want him to come to a Bible study, which he doesn't want to come to, but they keep twisting his arm. And so he finally goes to this Bible study, and it is on a house on Aldersgate Street. And that phrase, Aldersgate, there are Methodist churches around the country that are Aldersgate United Methodist Church. So this street, Aldersgate Street, becomes one of those words in Methodist lexicon that becomes a Wesleyan word. So he goes to this Bible study on Aldersgate Street. And what are they studying? Well, they're studying the book of Romans. More specifically, they are studying, for those of you who have been here the last few weeks, they are studying Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. So they're studying Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. And, just to recap, Martin Luther, with the Protestant Reformation, who basically said that the Roman Catholic Church was focusing on all the wrong things and people buying their way out of purgatory and all the things that he saw as being non-biblical in Roman Catholic teaching. And Martin Luther's emphasis was we are saved through faith by the grace of God. Salvation is through faith by grace, not by works, by grace. So that's what's being read. Luther's words, Luther's teaching on Paul's words in the book of Romans. Now remember, John Wesley is already a priest. John Wesley has studied theology. John Wesley has studied Greek and Hebrew. You know, John Wesley has the equivalent of a seminary education and more. You know, and yet as they read Luther's words, commenting on Paul's words from Romans about we are saved not by our works, but by grace, by faith, there's a light bulb that goes off, you know, in Wesley's heart. And here's Bill, here's if you'd pass out, I've got a sheet with some quotes from Wesley. And the first quote is from Wesley's journal from that night that he is at the Bible study on Aldersgate Street. So I'll give you a second to get that. Because some of the people at this Bible study are some of those same Moravian Christians that he encountered on the boat, on the ship, on the way to Georgia. And it is it's through that we have this quote from Wesley's journal, his diary. So here's the quote, that first quote. In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that He had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So this is referred to as Wesley's conversion. You know, as I say, now he was raised as the son of a preacher or son of a pastor. He'd gone, studied theology. He'd been ordained as a priest, and yet it is that Bible study and that night that is counted as when he had his, come to Jesus moment. And the way it's been described is that it was on that night that the gospel traveled 18 inches. The gospel traveled from here to here. The gospel traveled from his head to his heart that night. Because, you notice he says, he did, taking away my sins, even mine. Wesley, as a priest, had been preaching, God loves the world. God took the sins of the world. But it was that night, God loves me. God took away my sins. To say, God so loved the world, God loved humanity, but it was another for him to say, God loves even me. God loves even me. So this is a watershed moment for John Wesley. And that phrase, my heart strangely warmed. Slight sidelight. When I was in seminary in California, the seminary had a little sandwich shop on campus, and every sandwich was named after a different church leader or theologian. the John Calvin says, you were preordained to order this sandwich, you were destined to order this sandwich, etc. That, there was the Luther, there was the Calvin, there was all the sandwiches were named after a theologian. But the John Wesley sandwich was strangely warmed. So Wesley has this experience that, and his preaching changes, before he was called an enthusiast because of their, dedication to praying 3 hours a day and visiting the prisons and spending all their time in Bible study and this methodical approach to life. But now his preaching has, what we would call enthusiasm, because his heart is now sort of on fire for God. And so this new, fire that he has in his heart starts to come out in his preaching, which of course is why he's banned from preaching in churches, because they didn't want that. That's too upsetting. They wanted something nice and boring. When I teach this to confirmation kids, they're like, oh, the Church of England was very proper and very restrained and very, stiff upper lip, and very British. And the idea of somebody being enthusiastic was distasteful. So Wesley, nobody wanted Wesley in their pulpits. Nobody wanted him to preach in their churches because of his enthusiasm. Well, about this time, Wesley had a friend from Oxford by the name of George Whitefield. George Whitefield. And George Whitefield had also a passion. And Whitefield's passion was for the fact that the common people of England, that we would maybe call the blue-collar people of England, weren't in the churches. They weren't really welcome in the churches. The church was very stiff and proper, and people, wore their Sunday best, and the blue-collar folks didn't have their Sunday best. They didn't smell good because they'd been working, hard labor. And, the common people, the working people, weren't really welcome in the churches, and they weren't showing up in the churches. And Whitefield had a passion for reaching these people who were not the upper crust, but who were the regular folks. And so Whitefield, like Wesley, was not welcome in the proper British pulpits. So Whitefield had started going to the common people and just preaching outdoors, just preaching, in the streets, basically, and was having great response. But he was just one man. So he goes to his old college friend, John Wesley, and says, you need to be doing this. You need to be bringing the gospel to the regular people, to the common people, to the working men and women. And Wesley is very hesitant because he's a proper Oxford teacher. He's an Oxford educated priest. Even though he's now got this new fire, he's still an Oxford educated priest. There's the second quote on the sheet from his. He said, he sees Whitefield do this. I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he, Whitefield, set me an example on Sunday, having been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. Like the whole idea of preaching anywhere other than behind a pulpit seemed so unseemly, so just, wrong to not be in a robe behind a pulpit in a church, that the idea of preaching outside just seemed, like something that he could not bring himself to do. But his desire to bring Christ outweighs his own hesitancy. I didn't put this quote in here, but in his journal, the first time he did it, he said, "I submitted myself to become more vile." I submitted myself to become more vile to preach outdoors. So the first place he does this, and this is somewhere that the four of us also visited, because we went to Aldersgate Street. There's a plaque on Aldersgate Street in London that says, "This is where John Wesley had his experience." We went and stood next to the plaque on Aldersgate Street. We went to the place where he first preached outdoors, which was Bristol in England. And at least in the 1700s, there were coal mines in Bristol. And so the coal miners, the shift would be over, and the coal miners would come out of the coal mines of Bristol, all covered with black soot, dirty and all that. And Wesley got up on a tree stump, and as the coal miners are coming out of the coal mines at the end of their shift, Wesley starts preaching to the coal miners as they come out of the coal mines. And they stop and they listen. Hundreds of them. And again, I didn't put all these things from his journal in there, but Wesley comments how some of them, as he preached salvation, as he preached your sins can be forgiven through Christ, as he preached salvation, some of the coal miners started to weep. And these little lines in their faces, they're black with the soot, the little lines started to show up on their black sooty faces where the tears were coming down out of their eyes. And so Wesley started doing this outdoor, as he called it, field preaching. And he started doing it in 1738, and he continued to do it for the next 50 years.
Were the coal mines on Bristol Street or in the town?
In the town of Bristol.
Yeah,
in the town of Bristol. Yeah, in the town of Bristol. Yeah, in the town of Bristol. So this becomes Wesley's modus operandi for the rest of his life, traveling from place to place, getting up on a chair or a tree stump, or something else, and preaching 2 or 3 times a day. Now, the established clergy and bishops of the Church of England did not appreciate this. They did not like this at all, because much like the Catholic Church, the Church of England into parishes. In other words, territories like this area, this church, that's the parish, and that's the church for this parish. And if you're in the Church of England, that's your church. It's not like, well, I think I'm going to go to this church over here. I think I'm going to go down the street to that church. No, if you lived in this area, you go to this church. It was your parish. And so Wesley, preaching in somebody else's parish, the parish priest of that area did not like the fact that he was preaching in his parish. Complained to the bishop, complained to the authorities. Wesley was not welcome to preach inside of churches because of this. Mobs would show up and throw tomatoes and rotten fruit at him. One time somebody came up behind him as he was preaching and dumped a tub of dung on top of him as he was preaching. And things like that would happen to him as he was doing this. He would have hecklers and people yelling at him as he was trying to preach, without benefit of microphone, of course. So sometimes he would face great opposition in this endeavor. But he was just one man. And, not only did he do this, but there were other priests in the Church of England who basically said, I want to be a part of this movement. And he started gathering a group of other priests to do this with him. But that wasn't enough, because they wanted to start covering England. Wesley started recruiting lay preachers, In other words, they weren't priests, they weren't ordained. He started recruiting lay people to also preach. and go from place to place and preach. Now, Whitefield is doing the same thing. But here's the difference between George Whitefield and John Wesley. And here's why you probably never heard of George Whitefield, even though he's the one who convinced Wesley to do this. Because George Whitefield would go to a town or a village or a place and preach, and people, some of them would have a conversion experience, some of them would find Christ, some of them would pray, and then Whitefield would go to the next town, and the next place, and the next place. What Wesley did was different. Wesley would go and he would preach, and people would come to Christ, and people would find salvation. And Wesley would say, if you want to know more, come back tonight. And people would come back tonight, and he would organize them into like Bible study groups and tell them to meet weekly. Whitefield would just preach, and people would get fired up, and then, but the fire would probably fade. But Wesley knew that these new Christians needed to have a regular weekly time to, study together, pray together, etc. So he formed what he called Methodist societies, or he called them bands, B-A-N-D-S, not like a marching band, but I mean, that's what it meant. What we would just call a Bible study or a small group is what we would call it. And so now his intention in all of this is this whole thing. His intention is never to start a new church. Just like Martin Luther didn't start out wanting to start a new church, he wanted to reform the Catholic Church. And that's why they call it the Reformation. Martin Luther just wanted to reform the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church wasn't open to Luther's suggestions. In the same way, John Wesley wasn't trying to start a new church. He was trying to bring life and fire to the Church of England. So for his entire life, John Wesley remained a priest in the Church of England. He never left the Church of England. He was an Anglican priest until he died. He saw this as a reform movement, as something that was supposed to help the Church of England. He told his people they needed to go to the Church of England every week and receive communion. I mean, he wanted this to be something that would bring life to the Church of England. But these Methodist societies started to continue to grow and grow and grow. And he got more and more people involved and got more and more people in these bands. Now, the movement grew so big that, they started to think, who else needs this? The colonists in America. The American colonies need this movement. So, Wesley took it upon himself to appoint priests to go to the colonies to spread this Methodist movement among the Church of England churches in the colonies. This is in the mid-1700s. What's happening in the mid-1750s, 1760s, 1770s in the American colonies? Yeah, there is obviously great friction arising between England and the American colonies in this time period. When the Revolution breaks out, most of the Anglican priests head back to England. But a couple remain, and after the war, the Church of England in America, in the United States of America, in the new country, the Church of England is not very terribly popular in the USA following the Revolutionary War. The Church of England is not particularly popular in the new USA. So two leaders of the Methodist movement come to America post-war to start the Methodist movement for real in America. One of them named Thomas Coke, one of them named Francis Asbury. So Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke are sent by Wesley to lead the Methodist movement in America. And, you may have never heard of Thomas Coke. You've probably heard of Francis Asbury, because there's quite a few Methodist churches named after Francis Asbury. As a matter of fact, all over America, there are many, many Asbury United Methodist churches. There used to be one in Tulsa. Where I grew up. But you probably haven't heard that much about Thomas Coke. But Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke actually formed a publishing house. Cokesbury. Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. A house called Cokesbury, which is still the name of the Methodist publishing house today. So, as I say, Wesley himself never left the Church of England. But in America, the whole Church of England thing was not going to fly. So under Francis Asbury, Asbury becomes the first American bishop of Methodism. Under Asbury, the Methodist Church is formed as a separate church. So even though John Wesley is British, the Methodist Church is formed in America. America is the birthplace of the Methodist Church. And it was founded in 1784 on Christmas Day in Baltimore. That's the birth of the Methodist Church in America, 1784, Christmas Day, Baltimore, Maryland. And that is where our church came from, at what's called the Christmas Conference of 1784. Wesley was not thrilled about that idea that they had separated from the Church of England, but of course Wesley understood the reality of the American Revolution. His brother, Charles, was not thrilled that Wesley had basically assigned Coke and Asbury to lead this new thing. His brother Charles was like, John, you don't have the authority to do that, and Wesley just, he did it anyway. I haven't hardly mentioned Charles, but at least tonight, but his younger brother Charles, who was there at Oxford with him, of course, Charles is a part of this Methodist as well, but is also preaches, but Charles goes down, of course, in history, in Methodist history, primarily as the one who wrote the hymns. His brother Charles wrote several thousand hymns. The best, known ones: "Christ the Lord is risen today," "Hark the herald angels sing," lots of other. The Methodist hymnal has, I think, 70 some odd hymns written by Charles Wesley. Those are probably the two most famous ones, but his brother Charles is known primarily as the one who provided the music for the Methodist movement. Wesley in his life, we believe, traveled on horseback, preaching from town to town, traveled on horseback 250,000 miles on horseback. He preached probably 40,000 sermons, and he gave away probably 30,000 pounds. Because Wesley was a firm believer in make all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So if you look at Wesley's journal, when he was a young man, his income for the year was 30 pounds. Remember, we're talking British money. His income from the year was 30 pounds. He tithed 3 pounds and lived on 27 pounds. A few years later, his income had risen to 60 pounds, because primarily through books that he published. Most of his income came from books that he wrote. A few years later, his income was 60 pounds. He lived on 27 pounds and gave away 33 pounds. Years later, his income was 90 pounds. He lived on 27 pounds and gave away 63 pounds. As his income continued to increase, he continued to live on the same amount. He only kept what he was absolutely necessary to live on, and he always gave the rest of it away. Somebody said in his obituary, John Wesley died. He left behind a well-worn clergy robe, a library of books, and the Methodist Church. That was what he left behind. He was not perfect. Nobody is, except Jesus. When he was 48, he married a widow, a widow named Molly, and had a very unhappy marriage. And she eventually left him because he was really married to the Methodist movement. He would leave her for months at a time. He was never home, etc., etc., etc. He married very unhappily and never had any children. I think I mentioned in a sermon a few months ago, his views on a few things are, the view of Wesley's that I think is the most troublesome was that he did not believe children should play. He believed they needed exercise, so they should march. But he thought they shouldn't do anything so frivolous as play. When I say John Wesley was hardcore, I mean he was hardcore, and he expected everybody else to be as hardcore as he was. And most people do not have their day planned every 15 minutes and rate their spirituality every 15 minutes on a scale of 1 to 9. And as I said, when on our trip through England, as we went first to Epworth and then to Oxford, we didn't come to Georgia. Didn't come back to England. We went to Oxford, we went to Bristol, etc., etc. We ended up in London at Wesley's house in London. And as I said, I think in a sermon maybe a month or so ago, you can go to Wesley's house in London and you can go to Wesley's bedroom where he died. And off of his bedroom is a little sort of almost closet that was his prayer room that had a prayer bench that he knelt at every morning for 3 hours and prayed in that little bench every morning for 3 hours. So he was hardcore. He was probably not a fun guy. He was probably not somebody. But thing is, we have his journals and we have his sermons, but we think that the sermons we have of his don't have the illustrations, that they just sort of have the main points. And we know he probably used illustrations. I'm not sure if Wesley ever used humor. I may doubt that he ever did. He was not a humor type of guy. But his incredible dedication shows through. One of the things, of course, he was not only dedicated to saving souls, he would tell his preachers, your only business is saving souls. That's first, second, and last on the list. Saving souls is your business. But he worked tirelessly for the abolition of slavery, for the abolition of the slave trade. I mean, Britain did not have slavery, but they were involved in the slave trade. And he lobbied the Parliament. He worked on a fellow named Wilberforce to work for the abolition of the slave trade. He worked for prison reform in England. He worked for, the establishment of education for the poor children. I mean, he was involved in what we might call social causes. It wasn't only about individuals' conversion to Christ. He worked for the betterment of society, in things like prison reform, the abolition of the slave trade, education of the poor children, etc. These sort of things. He did not really see a distinction between personal salvation and the Christian changes that society should make in eradicating evils, and so the Methodist heritage is not, well, are we more about saving souls, or are we more about doing good in the culture and helping people who are in poverty or in bondage or in trouble? And it would be both. It wasn't, those two things aren't separate. The idea of, he would say personal holiness and social holiness are not separate. They're one and the same, the two sides of the same coin. Now, Methodism, of course, in America is different from Methodism in England in lots of ways. One, it's an actual church here. And you got a wide open country. And so the way that Methodism spread across America, especially not just in the cities on the East Coast, but as the country started moving westward, was what was called the circuit rider. And what would happen in America was that there would have these preachers that would be assigned a territory to preach. And it would be like, the equivalent of like half of Oklahoma. I mean, a huge territory. And these circuit riders on horseback would go from town to town, preach the gospel, administer the sacraments, form small groups, and then go to the next town. And they might only come back to that, and they might only visit each town once a month, once a quarter, once every 3 months. And the rest of the time, the church consisted of just those small groups. And the circuit rider would come through and, serve the sacraments, do, weddings and stuff, and then go to the next town and the next town and the next town on horseback. The Methodist circuit rider in America is kind of almost the folklore of Methodism. And the average life expectancy of a circuit rider in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the average life expectancy was 30 years old because the life was so challenging, so hard. And yet, one of my favorite circuit riders in American history was a fellow named Peter Cartwright. And my favorite story about Peter Cartwright, and I'm not a scholar of Methodist history. I mean, I'm giving you the bare bones. There are people who know, there's giant books written about Methodist history and Methodist American history and all. But one of the stories that I enjoy about a circuit rider named Peter Cartwright, who was a big man, and he was going to come to this town and preach the gospel. Well, one of the things the Methodist preachers preached against was the evil of liquor and saloons and all that in the West. So I don't remember the name of the town, but he was going to come to the local saloon owner knew that he didn't want Cartwright preaching in his town because he knew he was going to preach against, the evils of drink and all that. So the saloon owner stood at the outskirts of the city to tell Cartwright he was not welcome there. He was not going to be preaching. And Cartwright told the saloon owner not only was he going to be preaching in the town, he was going to be preaching in his saloon. And the two of them got into a fist fight. in the streets. But Cartwright was a big man, and it says that at the end of the fist fight, Peter Cartwright was sitting on top of the saloon owner, beating him about the head and shoulders as he sang, "All hail the power of Jesus' name." And he then preached at the saloon. So to be a circuit rider was, a rough life. Wesley provided the circuit riders with sermons of Wesley's sermons that they could preach. They didn't, if they weren't able to write their own sermons, they could preach Wesley's sermons. But if you were only hitting a town every 2 or 3 months, you didn't have to have a lot of sermons, But that's how the Methodist church grew, because they didn't wait for there to be a church building. They just went town to town, formed a church, formed small groups, Bible studies, said we'll see you in a couple of months, and went to the next town. And they just planted churches all across the frontier of this country. At one point, there were more Methodist offices in this country. They were often the first church to reach a new... Larry, I see a thought above your head as you were going to... Is that... Okay, I just saw that almost like, okay. So, that's where the Methodist Church came in our country. Now, of course, the Methodist Church is all over the world now. I'm kind of focusing on our country. The actual name of the church that was founded in 1784 was the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Methodist Episcopal Church. The word Episcopal just means a church with a bishop. We have a bishop in our denomination. Now, some denominations don't have bishops. We have a bishop. So the word episkopos in Greek is translated bishop. So we are episcopal in the fact that our structure has a bishop. So the name of the church was the Methodist Episcopal Church. Well, we talked about the impact of the Revolutionary War. There's the impact of the Civil War. Because in America, the issue of slavery becomes a heated debate, not just, in the country, but in the church. And it becomes a debate specifically, should Methodist pastors own slaves? Should Methodist pastors have slaves? And at a Methodist General Conference, and I'll talk about what that even means in a minute, but they voted and said Methodist pastors and bishops should not own slaves. Well, many Southern Methodist pastors and Southern bishops disagreed, and so the Methodist Church split in 1845 over slavery. The Methodist Church split in 1845 over slavery. And you had the Methodist Episcopal Church in the north and the Methodist Episcopal Church South in the south. So the church is divided north and south, just like the country, over the issue of slavery. What's interesting here in Oklahoma, of course, in 1845, Oklahoma is not a state. Matter of fact, in 1900, Oklahoma is not a state. Both denominations, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, both denominations start planting churches in new territories. So here in Oklahoma, Methodist Episcopal churches and Methodist Episcopal Church South. We had, in the history of Broken Arrow, the Methodist Episcopal Church was founded on this corner of College and Main in Broken Arrow, as the first church in Broken Arrow in 1903 as a Methodist church. 3 blocks from here was founded the Methodist Episcopal Church South. So Broken Arrow had both. We had, this church was the North Church, and the South Church was a few over there, like where Broken Arrow Neighbors was the South Church. That happened all over. If you've ever wondered, Tulsa, why in the world is Boston Avenue Methodist Church and First Methodist Church in downtown Tulsa, why are you got 2 Methodist churches 4 blocks apart? Why would you have 2 big Methodist churches in downtown Tulsa 4 blocks apart, Boston Avenue and First Methodist? It's because Boston Avenue was the South Church and First Church was the North Church. And that's why you have 2 big Methodist churches that are practically touching each other in downtown Tulsa. The Civil War ended. It took until 1939 for the 2 branches to reunite. So the North Church and the South Church rejoined in 1939. Now, here in Broken Arrow, the 2 churches rejoined a lot earlier than that. And it's in our history book. It was a lot earlier that the North and the South churches here in Broken Arrow were united on this location like in 1920 or something. I mean, a lot before the denomination did. But that's when the denominational 2 halves joined together in 1939 and were renamed then just the Methodist Church in 1939. And that was the name of our denomination from 1939 until 1968. In 1968, the Methodist Church merged United Brethren Church. Evangelical United Brethren Church. The Evangelical United Brethren Church was a church that was modeled after the Methodist Church by German immigrants. So it was basically the Methodist Church except in the German language. So, the services were in German, much after the Methodist system. Well, by the 2nd and 3rd generation of that church, they weren't speaking German anymore. By the 2nd and 3rd generation, they were all speaking English. It was a smaller denomination, but similar in structure and theology to the Methodist Church. So in 1968, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church to form the United Methodist Church. So that's why our name of our denomination is United Methodist. They took the word united from the Evangelical United Brethren and formed the United Methodist Church. So that, from 1968 until the present, that's the name of the church. Now, there have been other, you think about the church as a branch, and you think, okay, the branch for us is, here's for the first 1,000 years, there's just really the church. Then you got Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, East and West. Then from the Roman Catholic, you have the Protestant movement, and from the Protestants, you have Lutherans and Presbyterians and Church of England, and all these different Protestant churches. And then out of the Church of England branch, you have the Methodist Church coming out of the Church of England branch. But there have been other churches that have branched off from the Methodist Church, broken away from the Methodist Church. Too early on was because of, frankly, racism. Black denominations, two African American denominations formed because the churches were not mixed, racially integrated. So there's the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AMEZ Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. So the AME Church and the AMEZ Church are both African American denominations that came out of the Methodist movement specifically for the black community. There are other small denominations that have the word Methodist in their name, like the Free Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church, the Nazarene Church came out of the Methodist Church, the Salvation Army came out of the Methodist Church, the Pentecostal Holiness Church came out of the Methodist Church. Lots of other churches branched out of the Methodist Church. So like Salvation Army, General William Booth, and his wife were both Methodists who formed the Salvation Army. So the branch continues to go out from the Methodist Church. One thing it's not so much history, but it is, I always think, again, because I teach some of this stuff, maybe not in this depth in a confirmation class, but, just so you understand, was formed in the birth of the United States of America. The Methodist Church was born right along with our country. And so the Methodist Church's structure has a lot of similarities to the structure of the United States government. Basically the idea of three branches: legislative, judicial, and executive. I was going to say. Okay, so the legislative is the various conferences, and then the judicial, we have our own judicial council that is modeled after the Supreme Court. So but the legislative part is the meat of our system, and it's all around this word conference. Here, this church has what's called a charge conference. Okay, a charge is just the name of the entity. This is Broken Arrow First is the charge. Okay, every local church is a charge. So every year, every local Methodist church, every local United Methodist church has a charge conference where budgets are looked at, committee chair people are voted on, that kind of stuff, okay? That's a once a year meeting that is required by our, what's called the Book of Discipline. That's the rule book for the Methodist Church. So every local congregation, once a year, usually in the fall, has what's called a charge conference to approve committee membership, clergy salaries, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then once a year, called annual conference. That's coming up next month, third week of May. For the first time in person since 2019. We haven't been able to have it in person since 2019. Annual conference is for all of the churches in Oklahoma. Annual conference, all the clergy who are Methodist clergy in Oklahoma come to this meeting. And for every clergy, there's also a layperson. So that way there's half lay people. Two clergy, what's called annual conference. An annual conference, which meets in Oklahoma City, usually right around Memorial Day. That's where we vote on the budget for the whole state, for what we call apportionments, which is what we pay in for things like campus ministries and children's homes and to pay the bishop's salary and various things that the Restore Hub and all the Methodist churches do together, and the administrative costs of having the Methodist Church in Oklahoma. So we vote on the budget, we vote on ordaining new clergy and other stuff. So that's a yearly meeting of the Oklahoma clergy and lay delegates. That happens once a year. Once every 4 years,